My name is Jordan Copeland. Some of you may have taken a historical tour or presentation with me. I was a public defender in the Bronx for 10 years. And after that, I became a public school teacher, a fifth grade teacher in the Bronx, and I did that for 7 years. So I'm interested in history, and I've been around race in a slightly different way, the intersection of race and lower income, so not the Scarsdale experience, for a pretty long time. And in both of those professions, it's pretty important to notice race and discuss race and be conscious of it. And how I got into this particular project was I was reading this book on the left, and I learned that in the 60s, and also from looking at old newspaper articles, that there was a recognition in Scarsdale that Black people were underrepresented in town. And there were efforts to rectify that. And I was curious about what happened. Why did it start? When did it end? And I soon came to believe, in looking more, that to me, the story of what white people in Scarsdale did or didn't do was not as interesting or important as telling the stories of Black people who lived in Scarsdale. Because for the most part, it's an untold and fascinating history that goes back as long as there's been a Scarsdale. So I started off doing conventional research, census records, newspaper articles, but where this became really something I would say life-changing was when I started my interviews. I talked with 11 people. For this presentation, I owe so much to the Black people who trusted me to share their stories. You're going to hear from them later in the presentation. These are going to be the four main eras that I cover: slavery in Scarsdale, rural Scarsdale, suburbanizing Scarsdale, and post-World War II. So let's hit slavery in Scarsdale. New York State relied heavily on slavery for over 200 years, going all the way back to when we were a Dutch colony, starting in 1626. Slavery didn't end in New York till 2 centuries later in 1827. Farmers and early settlers in Westchester depended on the labor of enslaved Africans, who were as much as 1/5 of the colonial population in New York. And you can kind of see them down here on the bottom. I think it's a good representation. It's almost like, it's like showing, I don't know if it was intentional, because this is a 17th century depiction, that they're really the bedrock on which New York was formed. You may recognize this from the post office, Caleb Heathcote. So Caleb Heathcote, a wealthy merchant, formed the manor of Scarsdale in 1701. So the forming of it would be at the top. This is on one wall. It's a little bit of a silly depiction, and probably the most historically accurate thing here, he's supposedly buying it from the widow Richbell who owned the land, is the Black figure to the right, who would have been an enslaved person at that point. So in 1712, so basically, since he died in 1721, 1712 would probably be the lower picture about that. There were 12 inhabitants here in 1712. 4 were white. The other 8 were enslaved people of African descent. 2/3 of Scarsdale's population, and I used to think, I'm not going to get like too heavy-handed, but I used to kind of think of the post office mural as being kind of quaintly inaccurate. But I've started to think of how much more powerful it would be if you represented things as they actually were, with 2/3 of the people in the image being Black. This is 1755. Many familiar names, street names, house of the middle school, were named after white people who enslaved other people. The enslaved people, and I'm trying in my presentation as much as possible to keep the focus on Black people rather than the white people. At this point, many enslaved men and women performed really important trades. And as you can see by the survey here, there are much smaller numbers of enslaved people in each household, meaning they had to be able to do a lot more specialized things, not just kind of field labor. While many large plantations in the South had sizable numbers of enslaved people, in Scarsdale, there were very few in each household. And that means a certain sense of isolation, that there's fewer opportunities to socialize with other Black people, to form families, or to keep in contact with other family members who they've been separated from. So you'll see a few names in here. This is Mamaroneck and Scarsdale, but you'll see Cornell and Griffin. And I'm going to point you to Thomas Hadding. It's spelled a couple different ways, but I'm going to give you kind of the most infamous Scarsdale story about that era. You see here, this is Wayside Cottage. This is a picture from the 20s. It's still there on Post Road. Thomas Haddon, who was a white man, owned this Fox Meadow farm, 150 acres, going all the way down to the Bronx River, and he lived there. And the bequests in his will showed that By the time of his death at 1761, he had 3 children with his wife, and he had at least 5 more with a woman he enslaved named Rose. Amos, Lazarus, Dennis, Jacob, and Eleanor, and possibly Francis and Robert as well. What's amazing about this and why we know this is because he included them in his will. He referred to them as either my Negro boys or my Negro children, and he provided for their freedom and well-being after his death, including being taught to read. He referred to Wench Rose. Wench didn't have that pirate-sounding archaic sound back then. It just meant a young woman. The Wench Rose was the woman who he had the 5 to 7 other kids with. He gave her upon his death a cow, 10 bushels of wheat, an amount of meat. He gave her the clothes that she wore. It's bizarre that you would have to, in your will, give someone the clothes that they wore, but of course she was transitioning from property to being an independent person. He gave his children, he gave them some money. Before you give him too much credit for setting them free, he could have manumitted them while he was still alive. The other wrinkle that this, of course, raises is what it meant to be a woman in colonial America. That your husband would have 3 children with you and a number of other children with a person he enslaved, include you both in the will. But I find it particularly fitting that that house later became the headquarters of the Women's Club in Scarsdale and now is the home of the Junior League of Central Westchester. I see that as kind of a poetic reclaiming. This is our map of Scarsdale. To orient yourself to north and south, this is Post Road. Running up here, you can see there really weren't many roads back then. This here is a waterway. This would be Mamaroneck Road running here. This is Weaver Street. I believe this is going to be Crossway. There's almost nothing there. This is from 1840. So the east part of Scarsdale, this area down here was then, as now, known as Quaker Ridge because it was a Quaker community. It was first settled by the Parnell family in 1723. And by the late 1800s, Quakers in New York were required to free any people that they had enslaved on religious and moral grounds and provide for their well-being or give them a little bit of a head start. But some members of the Quaker families released their slaves, and others, including in the Griffin and Cornell families, still enslaved people after the official decree came down. The interesting thing also about this area, and I'll go into it a little bit later, is that they settled the area irrespective of these political boundaries between New Rochelle and Mamaroneck. So it was all this area here, and you're going to see how this comes into it a little bit later. Slavery was on its way out. It was to be phased out by 1827. In the Scarsdale census, there were still 4 slaveholders holding on till the very end, enslaving a total of 6 people. That was Caleb Tompkins, Caleb Secor, John Bonnet, and William Popham. Blacks were at this point an eighth of Scarsdale, mainly living on white people's land. So you can see from the chart that the free Black population in Scarsdale in the red bars is steadily increasing over those decades. The enslaved population took a little dip, went back up again, and by 1820, it was really on its way out. I'm going to check the question, see if it's anything. Lori says, regarding the post office depictions, have you reached out to the mayor of Scarsdale and his new committee against racism? This is new and they should hear it. The answer is, Lori, I gave them a preview of it, a version that's not as good as what you're seeing now because it didn't have as many of the interviews in it. So my hope is that they're there now. Regarding that, I think my role here, I want to be more of a historian and less of an advocate for today. Wherever this goes from there, and my hope is that this isn't going to be all me doing it. My first stage is I would like people to be aware of it and come to some sort of consensus about it. Maureen, question or statement, any plans for the village to change the names of the streets named after slaveholders? I'm horrified to live on Secor Road. Maureen, I think that's a conversation that we can certainly start that. It's akin to the Confederate monuments. I don't know if there's a slight difference between, I think, the streets, which are named after where the person lived, and, for example, Popham House, which was named after him as a prominent citizen. But this is, I think, Maureen, this is a question that I would like to hand back to you in terms of, it's not my decision to say what should be the name of somebody's street. My idea is that people should see this presentation. Maybe there's echoes throughout the community, and then the community decide. I think also, you don't want to be renaming streets. I think you want to connect all of these things to today. So as we'll get to later, if this would make a Black person more or less likely to come to town, I think that to me raises it to a higher level. So I don't, and that's, all right, we'll move on. Will replay be available? Yes, it's being taped. Fascinating. My God, and how are the dates of liberation different from Scarsdale and other parts of New York State? The liberation was a statewide thing. It was all of New York State was 1827. Wonderful questions, guys. Oh my God, I'm already feeling like I can't answer everything, but great. I'm gonna keep on going, and I'm gonna come back to this later. But I really appreciate this, and I think we're gonna go places with this, everybody. And we're into rural Scarsdale. Now, slavery is illegal in New York State. The Quakers were a stop on the Underground Railroad. Even after New York banned slavery, there were still laws, including federal legislation, compelling the return of Black people who had fled north on their way to Canada. I'll just say one thing. I'm generally skeptical of stories about homes as being part of the Underground Railroad, etc. It's a very satisfying thought to think, okay, there were good people. And look, a lot of people had root cellars back then, and the whole thing was secret, so you weren't going to publicize it. But in terms of how history has been revised, a lot of the Underground Railroad was Black people helping enslaved Black people, as opposed to white people coming in like a cavalry and doing that. So I want to keep the focus on Black people because I think that's really more the truth of it. Whether Wayside was ever a stop in the Underground Railroad, I doubt it. But anyway, but the Quakers definitely were involved in that. This is the cemetery of St. James the Less in Scarsdale. If you go there now, you can see this plaque there and the stones there. This and adjoining gravestones mark the final resting places of those unfortunate slaves who, despite help given them and many others in Scarsdale, did not survive in their plight to freedom in Canada prior to our Civil War. There's 13 of them. I have so many questions that I've been unable to answer. It seems like a lot to die in Scarsdale for a relatively short period of time en route. I'm not sure why they're at St. James the Less and not somewhere in the Quaker part of town, but this is one monument towards the people who, at least at that point, had been passing through. Although slavery was now illegal, there was still legal discrimination against Black people in this area. And so I want to point out one Quaker ally. This is Joseph Carpenter posing with an orphaned child. There's a Carpenter Pond just across the border in New Rochelle. He and his wife Margaret were radical abolitionists. He was born in Scarsdale in 1793 and later moved to a farm in New Rochelle. This couple sought to help enslaved people, fugitives, and orphans. One of the problems in the 1830s is that Black people often couldn't be buried in cemeteries, particularly, I believe, in New Rochelle, but I think it was all the surrounding area. So in 1835, Joseph Carpenter donated a section of his property for a racially integrated cemetery. He later died in the 1870s, and he was buried there as well. He was carried by Black pallbearers. Over 100 people were buried there up until 1905, when the land was sold. It now looks like this. It's at 150 Stratton Road, across from Iona. And if you go on in, there's almost no trace. There's animal paths, there's garbage, not too much. There's a bunch of baseballs that have gone in there. And it's really pretty much, it's been untouched for probably a century and a quarter. But I was able to find stones in a row. You can even find some things like this. This one's even more deliberately cut. This is just in the middle of a bramble. I found this one little stone here, right in this middle. And when you go on in, amazing. So you can see from the scale, it's 5-6 inches high. I couldn't figure out who HJ would have been. And there might be a few others if you really, really go crazy there. It's absolutely incredible. A survey of the cemetery in 1940 found it was already in really, really bad shape. And the earth is slowly coming up and reclaiming all of the stones. Now I can turn to some of the first Black people in Scarsdale who we really know something about. So this is an 1868 map of Scarsdale. This is the same. This is Post Road running north and south. This is Mamaroneck Road coming in here. And if you take Saxon Woods Road, intersection here, and you go on down here, down, you're going to see R. Purdy. And I blew that up over here, R. Purdy. If you're looking for a name to rename something after, he could be one. Robert Purdy, born in 1823, died in 1890. He's said to have escaped from slavery in Louisiana. Although in the 1880 census it said he was born in Maryland. Either way, he came to Scarsdale, supposedly through the Underground Railroad. He settled in Quaker Ridge and he worked on local farms. And he and his wife, Eleanor Lena Landrine Purdy, ultimately had 4 daughters and 1 son. And I invited, and I think I may have 2 of his great-great-granddaughters in the audience today. In 1856, Robert Purdy purchased 5 acres of farmland for $277 from George Willits, who you can see over here. Robert Purdy and his family raised livestock and grew a variety of crops. He raised bees, he sold honey, and the land passed down through his descendants. More houses were built, and his family was there for over a century, from rural Scarsdale up through the modern era. Before I hop off this map, I'm going to show you this joint district. This is where the Mamaroneck Strip comes from, because I'm going to point down here. You can see the schoolhouses down here. The schoolhouse where Quaker Ridge people used to go to was across the border in New Rochelle. And you would go there from Mamaroneck too, because it was a Quaker community. So that's the political history behind this border being kind of funny and living over here. When this was merged in 1965, everybody else came along for the ride. So this school down here is where the Purdy children would have gone to. They would have come down here and gone down what at that point was called Lincoln Avenue. It was originally Weaver, went to Lincoln, later went back to Weaver. And they would have gone to school down there. So I'll share with you some breathtaking pictures courtesy of the family of some early descendants. On the left, you have Sarah Purdy. She was Robert and Lena's daughter. In the 1860 census, she's listed as a servant. And then 3rd generation grandchildren, and there's many more. These were just particularly striking photographs. We have here Lillian Peterson Allen, known as Lil, and Idella Peterson. She later married a gentleman named Pitt. She was born in 1877. She's the grandmother of Robinette Robinson, who may be on the call. And then Idella Peterson, who later married James Pitt. She was born in 1883. She died in 1972 at age 88. So she saw the whole thing, all of Scarsdale's development. Truly, truly remarkable. So the Purdy children and the grandchildren attended this. This was the one-room Quaker school, along with the neighboring white children. It is striking down here to see the 5 Black children here. And by the ages of them, Idella would have been 7. So one of these children could definitely have been Idella. The 1890 census, as you may or may not know, was burned up in a fire, so I can't pinpoint exactly who everybody would be, but it wouldn't surprise me, and I would love to know that that was the case. This is 1890. So here we have Scarsdale's population from 1830 to 1900. The Black population is going up a little bit. The white population is going up proportionally a little bit more than that. So it's decreasing as a percentage of Scarsdale. Okay. Ron says, when I was in grade school, we toured a house that was reported to be part of the Underground Railroad and were shown a place in the basement where there'd been a tunnel. Yeah, again, I'm not looking to ruin anybody's memories or whatever. I tend to be skeptical of tunnels in general, because remember, these people were trudging on foot 2,000 miles from the south all the way north. So I'm not sure what the importance of a tunnel within Scarsdale would have been. They would have been, I think, probably trying to stay off main roads, traveling at night, going through fields. So the question is, where did the tunnel go? How far did it go? It's not going to be likely an engineering feat of 1,000 miles. So given the risks and the dangers, I'm just saying I'm skeptical. It could be true, but I just tend to be skeptical. Catherine says she confirms the Underground Railroad story. And again, I'm just a skeptic on this sort of thing. It could well be true. Wayside Tavern, as you can remember, there was slavery there, and it was also a tavern, and I'm not sure whether that overlaps with the era of fugitive enslaved people, but a tavern would not be my first choice for where to put up an enslaved person, because you've got strangers coming in and out. I think a more likely place would have been some farmer's barn that was away from the main road, because Post Road was the main road. So if you're worried, that wouldn't be the most logical place in my mind. Karen Smith asks about St. James the Less. Where are the bodies? Were they relocated? I don't know. They could well be there. I don't know the answer to that. Might you organize a tour of these locations? Anonymous attendee. I would love to. I'd be happy to once this whole thing calms down a little bit. I prefer giving tours because I like to see people in person. Laura D. Brown, there's still one relative living today. Yes, Carol Ann Peterson, I believe, is still there, and but I'm respecting her privacy. More questions. Lisa says the Wayside script now says that Thomas Haddon held a number of enslaved people. No tunnel existed. Another comment. Oh, yep, Carol Peterson. Excellent. Great. Lori says, one of the Pitt children was in my brother's class at Quaker Ridge School. This is most fascinating. You're welcome. I mean, the Pitt family, all of them were part of Scarsdale in their way. They served in World War II. I'll get to them later. I don't want to go out of order. As excited as you see I am. And I love these questions. I'm so excited to see. Rector of St. James here. Oh, hi, Astrid. Bodies are not there. So those are just markers to commemorate them. Wonderful. Really, really great. I love the questions. I love the interactive nature of it. It's sad during the pandemic that everything's, impersonal like this, but, it is what it is. We're going to go into Scarsdale becomes a suburb. This is a 1911 map. So just to orient you, this is what's called Old Mamaroneck Road. This is Saxon Woods Road coming on down here. And this is the descendants of the Purdy family. I zoomed in a little bit. You can see Sarah Johnson, Esther Johnson, Phoebe Peterson, and another Johnson there. So you've got additional houses built. And in the coming decade, they built a few more homes there. You can see it appears that they didn't have 5 acres anymore, that a lot of the land had been sold off and became the Fail Estate, which later became Saxon Woods Park. The house on the right is still there. These two houses, there's one house that I don't believe it could possibly be this one. It's short and squat like this kind of bungalow. And this was described to me as the original house. So these are examples of some of the houses that were down part of the Purdy descendants on Saxon Woods Road. There were 7 houses built on Saxon Woods Road by Mr. Peterson and Mr. Johnson. The names are changing because the Purdys had 4 daughters and 1 son, so they're going to the husband's name. These homes were later occupied by various Purdy descendants under the names Peterson, Johnson, and Pitt. This house, again, it looks very much like this. There's another house right next to it that I think is original house, but it has been added on to so much, but you can see that basic design is still there. This is a picture of Edmund Peterson. This is Idela's brother. This is a family photo from around 1920. William Peterson, Robert Purdy's great-grandson, was quoted as saying, quote, "We were hardworking people. We would work on our farm, then go off to our day jobs, and then return to the farm at night." And I like this picture so much because they're not in farming gear, but he's on some sort of farming implement. So I imagine he came back from whatever job the 3 gentlemen had, and now they're checking out new equipment or something like that. There's a really nice warmth to it. This photo, I wish I could find a better quality of it, but this is an astounding photo to me. So this is now the newer Griffin Avenue School. The old school was replaced in 1901. This building still exists. It's on the grounds of the Quaker Ridge Golf Club. This has to be, I'm going to guess, 1925 plus or minus 5 years, something like that. The black kids, looks to be about half a dozen of them, are sitting not off to the side, but they're within the mix. And this is not a scene that I think that you would see in a lot of schools anywhere in America at that time. The black adults who were there, I talked to Surya Al Peterson about this. I'll get to him a little bit later, but he didn't know who they were they bus drivers or worked. They had a hot lunch there, but he didn't know who they were. So I don't know who anybody is here, and hopefully somebody out there does and has a better quality of this, because this is just a beautiful picture. Starting in the 20s and the 30s, you have a flooding of black people, often from the South, into Scarsdale to work in domestic labor. So this is just a sampling. In 1930, there were 462 black people in Scarsdale. So an enormous, enormous jump up. You can see the occupations and you can see where they're coming from. Over here, the Ireland, this was mislabeled, but everybody else here is black. And they're coming from, this is just a few, some of them came from the islands, North Carolina and Virginia, coming up from the West Indies. And this David Ziegler, I will get into him in 2 slides, but just remember that name. So what was life like for domestic workers then? Race was still an issue. So these are from the Inquirer on the left, 1931. The ads for domestic workers included their race or their country. That still was considered relevant. People want to get work in Scarsdale. People come from White Plains, also come down for the days, but there's also a significant amount of live-in help in Scarsdale. If you look back in the 1940 census, if you look up your house, you might find, in a surprisingly small house, you might find that other people live there as well. This article on the right, Scarsdale Colored Chauffeurs Club, they have a big holiday party in the Masonic Hall in the Harwood building, 100 invited guests. They had a special speaker and an orchestra. It just looks like a lot of fun. So Black people in Scarsdale, service workers are coming together for each other. They're supporting each other, making their own community in that sense. You have a picture here of Nancy Fitch, class of Scarsdale High School, 1937. She's born in 1920. She just turned 100. And because her hearing isn't as good as it used to be, I communicated with her through her daughter down in Virginia and got her perspective on living in Scarsdale. What I hadn't known before I talked to Nancy was that some live-in help had children, and those children attended the Scarsdale schools. Nancy was one of them. Back then, she was Nancy Elizabeth Harvey. So in the yearbook, she's Elizabeth Harvey. She was one of 5 Black girls whose parents were domestic in Scarsdale and went to school there. She described Scarsdale as wonderful and remarked on the kindness of everyone. She wasn't close with the white students. Partly it could be race, partly it would have been an issue of class, given that she was the child of domestic workers. Her friends were the other Black young women who weren't all her same age, but they stuck together, and her friends from her church in White Plains. But she said she was grateful that Scarsdale High School gave her a boost into a long and successful career. She was the first Black head clerk in Westchester. She was in Mount Vernon. She also was an empowering volunteer. So in the yearbook, another one of her friends is there. So here you have Nancy, who wasn't as involved in the life of the school, but here you have Odell, who was also a Black child of domestic servants, but she was much more involved in school life. Odell has passed away, so I can't ask her. So we're going off of one person's recollections and opinion of how things were back then. If you asked Odell, you might get a different picture given how involved and how many other things that she did. And I love that there's an automobile club. It's really, really cool. This takes us to Surya Al Peterson, Scarsdale High School, class of 1952. He's a Purdy descendant. He grew up on Saxon Woods Road. He now lives in Tuskegee, Alabama. I spoke with him. I'll get to that in a sec. This is a picture of his parents. This is at 299 Saxon Woods Road. The numbers were renumbered at one point later, but this is in front of the barn that was there. Alfred Peterson and Josephine Baker. If this is 1930, as I believe it is, he's 19, she's 21. He grew up on Saxon Woods Road. She came up from Mississippi. Alfred was a chauffeur. She was a domestic worker in White Plains. This picture, it's like a Renaissance portrait. This is Josephine Baker up here. This is her sister and her friends and colleagues. I believe she, up here, and they appear to be sisters. And the one who's looking so strikingly in, it could be the angle, she might also be related to them as well because she's wearing the same dress as the one on the left. So I don't know the relation of all of them, and Surya didn't know the exact names of all of them. Josephine Baker and her friends or colleagues would meet once a week on a Sunday at her in-laws' house on Saxon Woods Road. In the paper at the time, there was a survey and loneliness was reported among servants. You might have your social outlets at church, but I think you can't underestimate the importance of Saxon Woods Road as being a safe base for people. You've got to think as being a domestic servant. Where can you let your hair down? Where can you laugh loud? Where can you complain to your friends if you're living underneath somebody else's roof? So this would have been a refuge or an oasis where you could go and be yourself and hang out with your friends at any time of year. So Saxon Woods Road, this is bringing up through the 30s. It was still isolated. You can see this is just a paper street. It wasn't built yet. Not for decades later were Boulder Brook Street and Secor Road built in there. You have the area down here. And by the way, these are plots, and later some Black and multiracial people also lived here, and you're going to hear from one of them today. But there's no homes here. They're just divided up into the lots. The Purdy descendants were really kind of out on their own there, and you can see the homes. It looks like it's an outbuilding here in darker, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 with the outbuildings behind them. This is the golf course, or this is the park by then. When I talked to Surya, he described that the family as not totally integrated into the civic life of Scarsdale. In the 1940 census, you see their jobs, and it's not the same professional jobs that other people in Scarsdale held. Domestic service, grooms at the riding club, caddies, mechanics, a clerk, and an ashman for the village of Scarsdale, which is a strength-building job.
It was a wonderful time. I never heard any misunderstandings of any of the families. Johnsons, Upshaws, Petersons, Pitts, a harmonious family. Idella Pitt and Charlotte Peterson every Saturday made hot rolls, and we had very good time, very, very harmonious time, helping each other. They helped me with my schoolwork, and in the back of Miss Pitt's yard and Edward's yard, that's sister and brother, in the back of their yard, there was a great big area. And they used to have they had picnic benches, and they would invite people down from White Plains. The people in White Plains would say, "Oh, we're going down to the country." And there would be a nice big, potato salad and fried chicken and so forth.
That certainly gives you a flavor of the full interviews. I'm going to give you the link. They're all on YouTube. I put them up on my channel. He describes the families being hardworking, close-knit, and self-sufficient. He said they had fruit trees from which they made wine and preserves, potatoes and onions. They grew them and stored them under the house. They raised and slaughtered chickens and pigs. He has a crazy pig slaughter story in his interview. They hunted raccoons and deer, squirrels and ducks. And many of the men became excellent golfers because at night, on summer nights, after the golf course was closed, they would just go back into their backyard and play. Jimmy Pitt, in particular, who worked for the village of Scarsdale, was an excellent golfer, would go play all over the place. Here's Surya. This is his junior year. You can get an idea of how isolated it would be. He still says he had friends, and there's a really funny story about him and a few friends going to Central Avenue at a bar, and his white friend handing him his ID so he could prove that he was underage, and the guy didn't even happen to notice that they were different races. I kind of like that story. I'm going to dodge over into Edgemont because there's a particular story that matters because I think it affected Black people in Scarsdale, and why you wouldn't see other Black professionals being able to move in. And that has to do with the restrictive covenants. In the 20s, Joshua Cockburn, you can see here, and his wife Pauline, they were prosperous and lived in Harlem. He was a captain of a Black crude steamship. And in 1932, they purchased land and built a house in Edgemont Hills. And after the house was built, they were sued by a neighbor because the original deed covenants for Edgemont Hills said that, quote, Negroes could only reside in the neighborhood as servants and could not own or otherwise use the property. Now, discriminatory deed covenants weren't deemed illegal by the Supreme Court until 1948. And I know the question somebody's going to ask, did they have covenants like this in Scarsdale? And I haven't actually looked at the deeds to confirm it, but I know that certain parts of town, Crane Berkeley, Sherbrooke, I've seen reference to that, but I haven't seen any deeds, but you could look at your own deed and see what is in there. A quote in the paper, in the Inquirer, from a neighbor said that no one bore the Cockburns any animus, but their presence and that of other Black people would harm, say it with me everybody, real estate values. A young Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP and the ACLU defended them, and in 1937, they lost. They lost. It makes my blood boil, as a lot of this stuff does even today. They lost the right to live in the house that they themselves had built. The only silver lining is that the plaintiff's attorney never entered the order because the Cockburn's attorney was clever and said, if you enter the order, we're going to appeal it and we're going to win. And then a whole lot more Black people are going to come to your neighborhood. So he kind of judoed them and used their racism against them. So they were able to continue living there, but the order wasn't actually entered. This is talking about the Purdy descendants, the lack of inclusion in Scarsdale. This is kind of a bittersweet article. So there's a community fund. The colored families in the Saxon Woods district have never been called upon for donations to the community fund, but this year they contributed 100%. No one ever asked them before, whether they assumed because they weren't professionals that they couldn't afford it, or that they didn't have some sort of connection. So it's really sad. Of course they donated to it, because a number of them served in World War II anyway. Black people really missed out on Scarsdale's suburbanization. So in America, owning a home is the way to build wealth and to pass it down to next generations. And this wasn't something that Blacks in Scarsdale were able to take advantage of. Owning your own home builds stability. You have control over your own destiny. Here's what this chart shows. The Black population after 1920, the percentage goes up. These are domestic workers. So they're living in white households at their employer's pleasure. With the exception of very, very few, they're not sending their kids to schools, and it might not be a whole family unit. It might not be a husband and wife. It was often just the woman. So the Black population is going up, but the Black percentage of the households is going down, 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 because there are many, many more homes all occupied by white people. And you can see who lived in Scarsdale. In 1940, Black women outnumbered Black men by almost 3-to-1. They were live-in help as maids and cleaners. In 1940, Black children were only 1/4 of 1%. In other words, 1 out of every 400 kids in the school would be Black by that time. Okay, Jordan, very interesting. My daughter is in Popham House. Where can we find more information about Popham? There's a great documentary, I don't remember if or a great article on the Scarsdale Historical Society webpage written by Barbara Shea McDonald and Leslie Topping about the history of slavery in Scarsdale. I don't know if he's mentioned, but I went back through Ancestry.com. We've got like the deluxe subscription, and so I looked at census records. But the Pophams were famous. This element of it should have surely been underplayed, but it's out there because they were big shots. They also, and I'm not looking to slam anybody. They also basically gave the land for St. James the Less. It's a dime per year for 1,000 years. I don't want to get too deep into that right now. Okay, Joan says that was still used as a school in the 50s. Dara says thank you. Mike says, did I understand that Scarsdale Country Club had a Black event in their premises in the 30s, though still restricted in membership? That I don't know the answer to that. I could definitely look into that. Things were restricted into the 80s, and Earl Graves was quoted at some event in some speech he gave of saying that even he lived on Heathcote Road on the board of American Airlines and Pepsi. A gigantic publisher was not allowed to join some of these clubs. When does Jerry Parnell and the Parnell family come in the 1950s? We're getting to that. So Joel, just hold on one second. Do you know the event behind the story of the 5 women? Wendy, I don't know. She says it could be a wedding that would explain the similar dresses. I don't know. Shelley, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Shelley, the daughter of Marcus Moore, who lived on Saxon Woods Road, says, my dad snuck behind those houses to play golf too. That is so, so great. Where's Edgemont Hills? It's just right across the Branche Parkway. It's up there. Were there any Blacks in Fox Meadow? I don't know of any Black homes, but it's hard to find this, but later there were. Did you look for Blacks being not able to build or buy houses because of the previous lawsuit and statutes? I don't know if it would have made the paper. If you were Black, you just wouldn't have been shown anything. So you're going to see, as we're moving into the post World War II era, how hard it was to be Black and buy somewhere. That you had the isolated rural Saxon Woods area, and then that started to get populated with other Black families because that was like the Black part of town. But when you want to put down your stake in Fox Meadow or Green Acres, that's going to be a whole nother thing. So you're going to see a little bit of that, but whether it was legal, whether it was de facto, whether it was people being steered away, it wasn't easy for that. Mike Otten said that he was at that talk. Amazing. Barbara says, I remember the story that Harry Belafonte wanted to buy a home at the corner of Griffin Avenue and Normandy Lane. I don't know whether he tried to, but I've heard that story, and then he later moved north, and that Floyd Patterson was denied the right to buy a home. Again, it wouldn't surprise me. Bob Berg, he can confirm that Crane Berkeley was developed and marketed as a restricted community. The deeds were restricted, the restrictions prohibited Jews too. And then he says, and I would agree with this, after the Supreme Court in 48, and this, you're going to see this in a second, Scarsdale real estate brokers for years knew better than to bring Blacks or Jews to Crane Berkeley. And it largely continued, and he's pleased, and I'm pleased as well, that he was a Jewish president of Crane Berkeley. For sure. Okay, wonderful. All right, we're going to move on into the post-war era. So this is post-World War II. This kind of puts a smile to my face, but like with a lot of stuff, it's kind of bittersweet. There's a lot of stuff about Scarsdale being largely white and them bringing in or trying to expose them to Black people. So they brought in a children's book author to Edgewood, and she's trying to teach them tolerance. It's hard to learn tolerance from a book. You learn tolerance and you learn about other people from being around other people. Having people who are different than you, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race or whatever. But they were trying. So here, the quote is, the younger children heard a story about a jolly little boy and his adventures with his new roller skates. The fact that he was a colored little boy was merely incidental. Then the question was asked to the Edgewood kids, someday you'll meet somebody like that who doesn't look like you, but who will be an awful lot of fun to play with. Would you like that? The author queried. A unanimous, delighted yes was the answer. Someday you'll meet someone Black. It's, you know, it's sad. It's sad for everybody. It's sad for everybody. In the 50s, though, we started to see a preview to the civil rights movement, that there started to be an awareness that a mostly white student population taught by white teachers was not good for anyone. The Urban League came to a Board of Ed meeting and suggested that there were a lot of Black teachers who would broaden the citizenship scope of Scarsdale students, and a lot of them didn't know when Scarsdale was hiring, and basically, would you keep us in the loop? Could you just show us the qualifications and we'll help you get some Black teachers? This fella here writes into the Inquirer, outraged that the Urban League would come here to help the board recruit teachers. They're entitled, who would even be permitted such a hearing, and basically a percentage of the Scarsdale's Community Chest Fund, that was the one during World War II, the very same fund, has been allocated to the White Plains Urban League for the purpose of helping the Negro help himself, as if helping himself did not also mean helping him get a good paying job, etc. But what makes me happy, this Marion Newman puts him on full blast in the paper the next week, saying who could possibly protest publicly on this subject, almost inferring a little bit to the Scarsdale genteelness. You don't do things publicly, even if you oppose it. It's high time that our children should be educated to and by the Negroes. Shame on him. You can see that there's a bit of a split in the community. And then in the 60s, other Black families, often World War II veterans, moved to isolated Saxon Woods Road, including the Moore and the Parnell families. I'm going to give you a short clip of Helen Parnell. She might be watching, and she said she doesn't like to watch herself, so I made it a little bit shorter. She's just going to be describing what life was like.
In Black families especially, suddenly you have all these surrogate aunts and surrogate grandmothers. And the Pitts and the Petersons became our surrogates, and so the Johnsons. in those years, because our parents were working, Granny was where I remember going there after school. So, that was, we get off our bus and we walk 2 houses.
It just warms my heart, the idea that family moves in and then their neighbors really take care of them. Black people in Scarsdale taking care of each other, looking out for other people is something that you're going to continue to see. Obviously, to some degree by necessity, but also clearly a generosity, because she's talking about culture. So in the 60s, you start to have Scarsdale groups formed, and there were Black people involved in some of these efforts to try to get integrated housing. What you had people in Scarsdale who were reluctant to sell to Black people because they didn't want their neighbors, soon to be former neighbors, to be upset at them. Again, whether it's direct animus or this supposed real estate value business. And the real estate brokers felt caught in the middle. So the quote here from this unnamed realtor in this article from 62, it says, the fair housing movement puts broker in a difficult position. The first broker to sell to a Negro is going to find his name is mud. The neighbors are going to blame the broker, not the previous owner of the house. If they're looking for a fall guy, he'll be it. Around the same time, the Moores who had already been living there, this is Shelley's parents, wrote to basically attest to Scarsdale having been a friendly place for them. So you've got these kind of two sides of the coin of people being suspicious of Black people moving in, resistant to sell to Black people, and then you've got the brokers who are picking up on that, and they're going to steer people away from them or not meet them at all. In the coming years, they worked on a pledge to try to get people to agree to it, and it was an effort. Here's Shelley. Here she is in high school, and there she is in a clip from our interview. Her parents come to town. Her dad is a dentist, and her mom being appointed to a Scarsdale village committee was such big news that it made the New York Times. Her dad was the first Black person admitted to the town club, which at that point was all men. And his wife was appointed to the Advisory Committee on Human Relations. What you're seeing now is a bit of the pivot with the Parnells and the Moores coming, and then with other families. Now you're starting to get Black professionals in Scarsdale. Her parents, and I asked her about them in the full interview, they were very civically involved. I'll show you a really nice picture here. It's in 1962. This is the Girl Scout trip to Washington. We heard from Helen Parnell. She's here in the front row, in the back row, Shelley. And over here on the right side is her mom. She went by Skippy, at least the name that I saw. And you'll see those gloves that the moms wore. So it really brings you back to a certain era. I don't know whether that was a wearing thing or whether that was part of the Scout mom outfit. It is a multiracial group, and it's being led in part by a Black woman. There started to be in 65 greater recognition of the lack of Black representation in town. And this article, again, from the Inquirer, it's a little bit worded, a little bit funny, but they say that there's only 10 Negro families in the entire school district and only 12 Black kids attend the schools. But there were 4 Black teachers by that point, and a 5th one was going to be added in the fall. Our children's exposure to Black people is largely through their contact with domestics. Sally Parnell, mom of Helen and George, who you're going to see, she described teaching in Tarrytown, and she recalled a white student of hers being astonished when she brought one of her children to school as a baby. Because the white child had had so little contact with Black people, he thought that Black people were born full grown as maids and butlers. It's sad. I mean, they're a little kindergartner, but still, they're not getting exposed to as many people. The Fair Housing Group embarked on a good neighbor pledge, saying, basically, if my neighbor sells to a Black person, I won't be upset. In 68, the effort shifted to providing low and moderate income housing, specifically here on the then undeveloped Freightway site. Opposition developed on a community-wide basis based on potential impact on spending and taxes in the schools and congestion. And I talk about this in a video with Offie Wortham and with George Parnell, that isolating a lower income group from the residential district and putting it in a business district might wind up accentuating the differences that everybody sought to reconcile. The village board rejected that proposal. But 2 months later, the trustees established the Scarsdale Open Society Association, SOSA. It was a nonprofit organization to lend down payments to minority group members with good credit ratings, such as these. Apropos of the point that I said earlier, Black families then, and Black families even today, have lower levels of intergenerational wealth being passed down. And many people in Scarsdale, even today, have the income to do it, but wind up borrowing the down payment from their parents or something like that to get that 20% down. And they noticed that that was a bar to being able to attract Black people, whether they could afford some of it or need all of the help. So they started giving loans for the down payments, and Reverend Bernard and Shirley Holliday were recipients of a loan for part of their down payment. From 1960 to 1980, the number of heads of primary families who were Black increased from 20 to about 50. So it starts to make some progress. About 15 Black families had accepted loans from SOSA, and some of them since moved away. But it may have been a symbol that this is a town that's committed to increasing it and attracted Black families who could afford a down payment. School integration. This is obviously a hot button issue. The school started off with the STEP program that was established to help Black kids from the segregated South finish high school. And that number, there were 6, went up to 12 kids from the South, and then it tapered up, but that program still exists today. But Scarsdale's residents disagreed sharply over a plan to bus minority children from Mount Vernon into the Scarsdale schools. And while the Board of Ed ultimately voted 6-1, pretty much over the will of the community, or some of the will of the community, to adopt the integration plan where they would be bringing 25 kids per year and increasing that. This was a federal plan. They would be reimbursed, so Scarsdale wouldn't be anything out of pocket. It turned out the Mount Vernon Board of Ed, they had their own internal busing issues, and they had a largely white Board of Ed at that point, and the Mount Vernon Board of Ed voted it down. The only person to vote for it was the one Black member of the Mount Vernon Board of Ed. But it's an interesting counterfactual inquiry to think of what Scarsdale schools would have been like if this plan had actually come to fruition, as it almost did. So speaking in favor of the plan was Ms. Jasper Parnell. You saw her earlier. She said, "I put 5 kids through the Scarsdale schools. They were all Black and it didn't seem to harm the white children." And the Reverend facetiously commented that he supported the proposal, even though he, quote, had no children in the Scarsdale schools, the Catholic priest. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of people. This is Offie Wortham. He ran a storefront community action program in White Plains, and there were a bunch of white women who went up there and volunteered. And so he wound up being invited to a bunch of dinner parties, and in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, they wanted to use their connections to help Black people, namely Black businessmen in Westchester. And we're going to contrast that with Joretta Evans Crabbe describing her parents trying to buy a house or buying a house in Heathcote in 1969. So this is not on Saxon Woods Road. And as background, her parents were both Black. Her mother was lighter. Her father was darker.
That was a punch bowl there, and there was this Black businessman with his son, and there was another guy who owned a big office complex in Manhattan, and he just casually said to this guy, he says, "What do you do?" He says, "Well, I run a janitorial service in White Plains, New York." And I knew what this was. I mean, it was like, okay, a Black guy and a son running a janitorial service. Maybe they're cleaning out 4 or 5 buildings, right? Big deal. Mm-hmm. So this guy says to him, "Well, I own a business on 5th Avenue, a 20-story building, and I need a janitorial service. Can you handle that?" Mm-hmm. And the Black guy said, "Oh, sure." I mean, I saw and I know a handshake. We're talking $1 million business on a handshake.
My father and mother looked at houses. Some of the houses my father didn't look at if the family was going to be home. This is 1969. And then so my parents looked at the house and the owners were not home. They went to contract. At contract, my father came. And that was the first time that the owners had seen my parents. And so they actually signed the contract. And then that evening, they got home and my father received a phone call from the owner of the home saying, my wife is threatening to kill herself. She is going to pull up all the plants outside the house if you buy this house. We had no idea that you were Black and she can't do it. I'm going to give you $10,000. Think of that. The house is $40,000 in 1969, which is a lot of money now. Yeah. And I'm going to give you $10,000 to get out of this deal. Then my father said to him, I'm very sorry your wife is going to kill herself, but that is our house.
It's, you can see her full video. The wife did not kill herself. She did pull up all the plantings, though, when they came to move into their house. It gives you an idea of what you would have to go to and the fortitude and the backbone you would have to move in, because something like this could happen even just in the closing. Joretta also gave me the letter that the seller wrote to her father afterwards. I regret that the incidents which caused me to speak to you on Thursday night came up, but now that the air is cleared, I want to assure you that we will be proceeding in an orderly and direct fashion on the sale of the house to you. This is, as an apologies go, it's not even really an apology. And then the bottom quote, I am sure you will find the house in the neighborhood an interesting one to live in, and I expect to see you in person on the date of the closing. It's this veneer of gentility over disrespect and racism, obviously, expecting to be forgiven, expecting to just move on from something like that. And this is something that, if you're on the receiving end of this, you never forget that. There's postscripts. If you watch her video, you'll see that as well. And then another really interesting thing that Joretta shared with me, typed up list. We don't know who typed it. Black people in Scarsdale supporting each other, being resources for each other, giving contact information out. So somebody took it upon themselves to write up the list of people. Frank Foster, he was a jazz musician. Earl Graves, his wife was Joretta's mom's best friend. And the Hollidays you can see here, and the Moores you see here, and the Parnells are here. And there's many, many more who I haven't gotten a chance to speak to. The Duncansons. It's an amazing thing. There's no list of white people in Scarsdale. There's no Scarsdale White Clocks. You don't need that list, right? This shows depth of supporting each other and being there for each other and helping each other in this situation that together we're going to make it work. This is Jasper Parnell. He was someone who advocated for the civil rights of Black people in Scarsdale. He lived on Saxon Woods Road. And for a while, they got their mail from the White Plains Post Office, and he leveraged and used the power of some white people in Scarsdale, and they went down to Washington, D.C. to meet with the postmaster general or an underling and got it changed, got their part of town included in Scarsdale PO. That means something. He was also a member of the Fair Housing Group of Scarsdale. He was a board member of STEP. He was on the auxiliary police. And here you can see he's going and speaking to the trustees about real estate brokers trying to harass Black homeowners into moving out so that the white people can co-opt even that part of town. He also is saying that the repair work that's being done there should be done according to the law. And also there were Black lawn jockeys on people's lawns, and it's offensive. When he brought it to people's attention, there were kids in the high school who volunteered to paint them over white color or neutral color or something like that. This is one of the Parnell children. You can see what growing up in the 60s through the 80s was like. I hope that what you take away from this, and especially after you see the videos, is the nuance. When I spoke to Black people who lived here, I got from everybody having wonderful, wonderful friends of other colors, but also being other to varying degrees, that they pushed themselves towards tremendous academic achievement, but they were simultaneously undervalued for what they did. There's so much more in the full videos. I'm going to show you some videos now, except for the last video, Rashid Silvera, who was a legendary high school teacher. And for some of these students, he was the only Black teacher who they had. So it seems like from that earlier era where there were 5 Black teachers, there may have been a recession from that. And I don't know where we're at right now. You're going to see Shelley Moore Christiansen, Susan, some of you knew her as Leota Branche, George Parnell, Maynard Holliday, Cheryl Holliday McBride, and Rashid Silvera. I'll put that on now.
Junior high school, you start being aware of, race as being something more than, it's not just, okay, different colors in the crayon box kind of thing. There's more social and political, aspects to that. What struck me the most was here we are, entering puberty, and all of a sudden this, girls are talking about boys and who's cute and who likes whom and blah, 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 blah. I was excluded from those conversations. Or when I say excluded, I mean, I could be sitting at the same lunch table while, the girls are talking, but I'm not really I'm sort of like being ignored in the conversation.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't something, Yeah. And so that was interesting to me. I mean, this was, it was never, said that, Shelley, you can't like white boys, or white boys aren't supposed to like you, but it's just one of those things that you intuit. I didn't go to my prom because there was no one to invite me to my prom.
When I went to high school in the 70s, and I felt like I had to work twice as hard to be known as half as good. And I think people did see me as the great student and an excellent student and an A student and all of that. But, I still don't feel like I was always seen as equal. And then there are lots of things that were said as I could write a book, but it was clear that I wasn't. And, that was like the height of also the age of affirmative action. And I watched a friend of mine who, he's a brilliant physician to this day and excellent student. And, when he got into a top school and when I did, and my brother who was basketball team, tennis team captain, A student, there was a huge amount of resentment, but resentment to the point of racism. Mm-hmm. And somebody wrote an article in the school paper my year that was really, really demeaning of minority students. And when I wrote back, there's a very condescending reply, and nobody spoke up and said anything. It was just me. I was the solo voice. So it still is that feeling of you work twice as hard to prove you're half as good. But that doesn't stop us. It doesn't stop my family and many others. And that's the way it works. But yeah, there was a lot of that, as is there a lot of wonderful people, wonderful supportive people that I encountered. I could, fill just as large a book on that.
The toughest part about growing up there for being a Black guy growing up there was not coming from a lot of money, having friends that had someone that had so much, including my closest friends. Because you can't say, hey, yeah, can you take me that? No, that's just wouldn't be appropriate, nor would I have thought to do so. Because you're a Black kid, you're not supposed to ask people for help because then they think you're stupid or think you can't do it. I think that message came more from just how society was, and a little bit of like my parents, like people say, oh, if they're Black, they're getting a handout or something, even though we weren't, obviously, but
right, yeah,
but and you think that these other kids are moving it on their own, not realizing, okay, well, Dad owns Hartford Insurance, and he's got a friend who's at E.F. Hutton, and so his son's going to get that internship at E.F. Hutton. There were those they're very good teachers, but they weren't. I don't think they were consciously unfair. But I knew that my work had to be perfect or close to perfect.
My parents were very deliberate and intentional about us seeing a more diverse community. So 2 things that they did intentionally was, one, we would go to New York City to Black churches, and then summers, my parents enrolled us in the Harlem School of the Arts. The other thing they did was join this organization called Jack and Jill. And, you had to be invited. It has a reputation of being bougie. And, but they were all spectrum of Black families in the organization. We would have monthly meetings and events. And so you got to meet other African-American kids. And so you had this peer group that were going to, White Plains High and Chappaqua and New Rochelle. Some of my sister's best friends, were in that group, and some of mine as well that became, lifelong friends.
Sometimes I would be on my paper route And the people would open the door and say, oh, would you like a cookie or whatever? And then we start talking, and then they would say, you know, I just love your hair. Can I touch it?
Oh my God.
And so then I would like bow my head down and let them touch my hair. Let them like pat it. And it happened more than once. It happened multiple times. And at that point, you know, I knew I was the ambassador for my race.
Right.
But yeah, that kind of like solidified, like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to have my afro touched because of their curiosity, because they don't know anybody. And so maybe they're gonna think it's steel wool, and they would always say after they touched my hair, it's so soft, like, you know, surprised, like as if it could be steel wool or something. And another thing that would really bother me is after vacation time, you know, a lot of the kids would go on these really nice vacations, especially in the winter, go to these islands, and they'd get tan, and they'd come back, and then they'd want to run up to me and put their arm next to my arm to see how dark they were, if they were darker than me. I mean, and that happened all the time.
Go to class one day, and there's a black girl sitting in class. She's sitting right up front. And Jordan, I don't know, it all of a sudden came to me that, that all of the black students, the brown students that I had at Scarsdale High School would come into class and always sit up front. In other words, once again, I get the look of the, you know, they weren't hiding. They wanted me, is there one damn thing they're going to do? They're going to say, connect with me. I attribute that to their parents a great deal, because parents can sometimes tell you, or can suggest that you don't want to be invisible here. You don't want to go Ralph Ellison here. You don't want to give that invisible man any more fuel. In other words, this cat, go get it.
Yeah.
He's not there by mistake. Go get it.
So I've got just a couple more slides, but obviously there's so much to unpack there. There's a lot of themes of keeping that connection up to your culture, of being underestimated, having to decide whether to speak up or whether to stay silent when kids are doing stuff. You're in the full videos, I'll give you the link. You know, you could be going to a sports event and all the other kids in the bus are trash talking the school you're going to, which is a black school or largely black school. And you're sitting there, what are you going to do? Put your head down or say something in front of everybody else? So I hope that there's stories of warmth and great friends, and there's also other stories of being profiled and being the recipient of racial slurs. So it's a full spectrum of experience. But what I'd like you to do, and I'll give you the link in a sec, to watch the full videos, and you could almost make a book club out of it to discuss them with your friends and family, because I think they're so rich, there's so much to it, but it's really as granular and varied as all of human experience. And I think it's also, I would describe it as individuals who've shown strength and resilience and humor in the light of a lot of this stuff. And also though, Black parents having to make difficult choices that other parents don't. And I'd asked many of the interviewees about the choices that they made raising their own children, and some of them have chosen places like Scarsdale, and others have chosen places that would be more diverse for their kids, and maybe not, 99th percentile academically, but are a little bit broader and are going to give you that cultural difference. So before, I'm going to give you two slides where I have now, I don't want to leave you with too much negativity, and I just have a beautiful clip, a bonus clip that has a lot of elements that I would draw out of the Black experience of Scarsdale, of having good friends, good white friends, wanting to fit in a little bit more, and people in the Black community looking out for each other. It's just 30 seconds and it's beautiful.
I had an afro until 8th grade when Mrs. Graves came to my house and she said to my mother, we're going to straighten her hair. Joretta cannot have an afro anymore. And my mother had really like white hair. So Mrs. Graves straightened my hair in the kitchen sink. She washed it in the sink and then she straightened it and then she washed it after. And I remember she blew it dry. I remember looking in the mirror and just being in shock. I couldn't believe it. I was so happy. Wow, now I can start to feel like all my friends.
Susan Branche referred to this. This was the supposed parody letter, and they're describing, it's basically a college rejection letter. For the most part, he or she was a minority student with the SATs in the 1700s, and she's a minority student, and she's got to make the decision, do I speak up? Because obviously this went through certain channels, and whether it got seen by a faculty member, she can't be just somebody who goes to school. She's also got to be put in the position of having to deal with stuff like that. Anyway, so where are we now? In the last 30 to 40 years, I don't have 2020 census. We won't have that for a little while, but the percentage of Black Scarsdale residents has not moved a lot. We're really kind of been pegged around 1.5%, which means if you are Black and you decide to move to Scarsdale, there's a good chance that your kid will be the only Black kid in their grade. Then if we back out and take the long view, just sort of recap it, the black line is the percentage of Black residents. So that was actually at its highest in the early part of the 1800s. Then it's been going down largely. This bulge here is, and again, this is a percentage, this is an absolute number. This bulge here is the domestic workers coming on in and living here. But then you'll see the household percentage. This down here, people are living in white households. It comes up, and then for 1850s, it basically tracks that you have as many Black people in their own homes, but then you have Black home ownership is much lower because they're living within, and I didn't have data for the home ownership, but you can see now we're about at the same level that Blacks basically owning their own homes, but we're still down 1.5 to 2%. All right. So I'm going to do some Q&A now, but if you want to jot down, if you want to email me, because I don't think that if you're Black and you were and you were seeing this and you want to talk to me and we can continue this, look me up, because I did things very much by chance. But you've got my email over here. This is the link to watch the full interviews. I think I have 10 up there now. And then I'm doing a couple tours. One's on the development of downtown Scarsdale. That's this coming Thursday. Then I'm doing the history of Arthur Manor next month. So a few questions. Okay, Joan, weren't there any discriminations in housing and civic organizations against Jews? Surely, yes. And it also, I'm sure that there were discriminations against Asians as well. But today I'm talking about Black people. But it's definitely true. Yes, I'm going to move on from that. Comment on Scarsdale's position regarding school segregation and busing. Yeah, I mean, Scarsdale's Board of Ed actually was a little bit ahead of the population in the 60s. They wanted to push something through that at least half of the white population of Scarsdale did not agree with. And if not for a chance occurrence on the Board of Ed in Mount Vernon, it would have happened and Scarsdale schools would be integrated now, I assume. Tony says the Kenyan government bought a house on Saxon Woods Road. And George Parnell told me about the South African South African government bought a house there. And he taught a child of, I don't know if it was the ambassador, how to ride a bike. A Black kid, I think he was a teenager at the time, teaching a white kid who was living under apartheid at home how to ride a bike. That's why you need people of different races living next to each other. Charity Bailey. I didn't talk about Charity Bailey. She had a little TV show as well. She was a great music teacher that I heard about. What is the Evans Heathcote address? In Heathcote. I think that was 22 Winmore. 22 Winmore. I'm a Black homeowner in Edgemont. Would love to find other Black homeowners. Do any resources exist for us to find each other? There should be. I'm the wrong person to ask, but Stacy, you should start a Facebook group, because I think that's the way people communicate today. And I don't know if there is one already, and I can think about how you do that, but I mean, you'd probably know better than me, but I don't know, but you should start a Facebook group, because there needs to be people who are a minority in an area face challenges that other people don't. So you need to have mutual support in how to deal with things. And it's important that if there's either something happening in the town or the village level that's not right, that you're not alone fighting it. You need to it gives you strength to become able to come forward as a group if something's not happening as it is. And you're not, and Susan talked about that, of being, you don't want to be the one complaining Black person. And then people can dismiss you, say you're not taking a joke, whatever. Instead, you're a group. So I think that's important. Charlie says, what lessons about affordable housing, integrated busing do you think this history can teach us today? I think I have racked my brain, and it's not my specialty, about the affordable housing in Scarsdale. And I talked with George about this, that you don't want a ghetto. You don't want a separate area of town, in my opinion, where there's people who are considered to be lower class or something like that. Is it better than nothing? It probably is. The problem is that Scarsdale is very much built out, and it is a community of single-family homes. There are some people who do live in apartments, but what you want is people of different races living next to people of other races. You want it integrated out in the community. And I don't know what other communities have been able to do that successfully. But some of it may be PR, but some of it is getting out of orbit. If you're at 1.5% and you're Black and you're looking to come here, you are deciding, I want the best education for my kids that I can get, and I'm willing to have them be the only Black kid in their class or in their grade or something like that. That's not a decision that other people have to take. So getting out of that and pushing up, I think you start to see further growth, as you would have in Scarsdale's history, whether it's Jews or Asians, that if you can get past a critical mass, then it starts to feel like more of an inclusive community, and then that will attract other people. Alex Duncanson, he was a Black family in Green Acres. Excellent. If you want to talk, hook me up. My interest is that it be seen and that it affect people. I mean, just speaking personally, this event, despite having worked in the Bronx and different settings and stuff like that, was life-changing. And I would not talk to my Black friends. I wouldn't ask them such probing questions or give them opportunity to speak. It would be awkward to do it, but the 11 people who spoke to me were so gracious and trusting, and to understand what other people went through I would say that it's life-changing. Have I interviewed any current Black residents? I was wary about reaching out to people and being like, hey, you're Black, want to talk about race? So at some point I kind of let people talk to me, but it was also, I was overwhelmed with stuff. I've been working nonstop on this, and I don't think this is going to end now, but I don't want to put anybody in an uncomfortable position. I think it's easier with a little perspective for somebody to look back on it and say, it was like this, it was like that, without worrying my next door neighbor, next time I'm walking my dog, is going to be like, what? You never told me you felt this way, or something like that. So maybe I'm being overly sensitive about that, but I didn't want to press people to talk about something that they were uncomfortable about. I wanted people to be comfortable and want to speak about it, and not put anybody on the spot. Will Black people who live in Scarsdale now be talking about it more? I would hope so, and I would hope, and if I can provide a tool forum for that, that would be great. And in other contexts, that's great too. With everything that's going on now, I don't want to say that, it's a weird thing. White people are like, oh, with everything going on now, this is the way I can lend my voice and help amplify Black voices. I think these are skills that I have, and I can't think of anything that's really more important. And I hope it's incredibly gratifying to me that to see Black people out there who are happy that the story's being told in the way it's being told. All of the people I spoke to had great friends who were white that they stay in contact with today. It's not a town that's with virulent racism, and nobody should feel bad about not knowing this already. You know it now, and now maybe hopefully there's a little bit of sensitivity to that you understand that some people carry larger burdens and they don't necessarily share it because they don't want to be other, they don't want to be treated special or whatever, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a little bit of an extra load of everything that especially kids put up with in Scarsdale, academic pressure and social pressure. Being of a different race is not always easy, especially when you're in such a small minority. I hope that the takeaway is not all about discrimination and difficulties. I hope it's also a legacy of a strong and resilient and a great community who was there for each other. STEP is a little bit different because STEP was an effort by people to bring in people from otherwise, and given the limited time, I was interested in talking more about the people who lived here their whole lives. But I think I tried to get in touch with the first STEP person. I think their perspective would be amazing to hear about what it was like to be here. No, Stephanie, that was not. There was a different. The Josephine Baker here was from Mississippi. Although I think both Josephine Bakers were from Mississippi, but she didn't go sing in Paris. But she's no less worthy of attention. The STEP people, the people who came for STEP, did incredible things. I mean, because they're like the valedictorians of their schools elsewhere. Then they come to Scarsdale, get like a little bit of a springboard, and then they go on to become federal judges and all sorts of stuff like that. Helen points that out. Yes, Sally and Jasper Parnell, they worked with STEP as well. I don't want to minimize the Black people's participation in any of those things. And also with the Scarsdale Fair Housing Group, there were Black people involved in that as well. Look, I mean, you say the presentation changed my life. I'm not surprised. It changed my life so much. And I can't recommend the full videos enough. They're candid. They just run, it's going to continue the conversation. Spread the word about this. Once you get the link, tell other people about it. And I think this is going to be the start of a long overdue, but really, really important conversation. Oh, I want to say one last thing for the few people who are still on there. If you check out Maynard's interview, there's a really, really important point that he makes for everybody. It's not important just for Black people to be in Scarsdale. It's important for white people to be around Black people. Whether it's cancel culture coming up, you don't want your kid going off to college and asking to touch a Black woman's hair and things like that. So even if somebody is approaching this from a strictly self-interested way or something like that, there are reasons why we want our town to reflect the demographic composition of our country a little bit closer. But it's really, I mean, it's good for everybody.